the sustainability side of things. It's really unsustainable to have animal agriculture. If we want to move away from animal agriculture, we need to do that both through the food that we're eating and how we grow our food. There's also a number of contaminants that can work their way into animal agriculture that can also work their way into the fertilizers. So, for example, in some cases, animals are fed heavy metals. In chicken manure, there have been problems, especially in the past, but it might still be happening in some areas today, of chickens being fed arsenic as an antiparasitic. Then there's arsenic in the chicken manure, and that's where you end up with things like arsenic in the organic rice supply. Because chicken manure with arsenic was used to grow organic rice, and even things like E. coli. When we look at the salmonella and E. coli outbreaks that sometimes happen, and it's blamed on spinach or it's blamed on lettuce, well, it should really be blamed on the manure that ended up on that spinach or that ended up on that lettuce.
Welcome back to the Plant Fuel podcast, where we dive deep into the green hearts of plant-based living, uncovering the stories and insights that inspire us to live more sustainably and mindfully. I'm Callum, your host and plant-based nutritionist, and today we're peeling back the layers of a topic that's fundamental to our health, our planet and our future: agriculture. But not just any agriculture, we're talking about veganic agriculture, a practice that could revolutionize the way we think about farming and food. Our guide through this enlightening journey is Meghan Kelly, the visionary founder of the Veganic Agriculture Network. Meg's passion and commitment to promoting plant-based farming and gardening practices are not only just transformative, they're also a call to action for anyone concerned about the environmental impact of conventional agriculture and the hidden intricacies of how our food is grown. This conversation with Meg was an eye-opener in the truest sense. Like many, I hadn't given much thought to the nuances of farming or what goes into our soil. However, Meg's insights have drastically broadened my understanding of the food systems and the critical importance of nurturing our land without relying on animal byproducts. We delve into the essence of veganic agriculture, exploring its benefits not just for the environment, but for our health and ethical living. Moreover, Meg shares practical advice on how we can all contribute to this green revolution regardless of where we live. For someone like me with a small balcony in Sydney, the idea of growing food seemed so far-fetched until now. Meg's tips on maximising even the smallest spaces for organic gardening are empowering and a testament to the fact that sustainable living is accessible to all of us. Before we get into this transformative conversation, I want to express my deepest thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey. And that what makes it possible to continue exploring and sharing these vital stories. If you're inspired of what you hear, please consider leaving a review or a rating on your favourite platform. Every little bit of feedback helps us spread the word, grow our community, and keep the momentum going for a healthier, more sustainable world. Let's get into it. Meg, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Wonderful to be here, Callum.
So you're in Canada right now, right?
Yeah, I'm in Canada in the province of Quebec.
Okay, sweet. So this time of year, that's pretty cold, I'm guessing.
Yeah, in Celsius, it's about -10 out right now, and we have maybe about a meter of snow on the ground.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can't, the last time I remember it being cold was when I was living in England, and that didn't get to -10 whatsoever.
Yeah, it's a little bit challenging here with the weather, but it gives us a time of the year where things are a bit quieter, and then another time when everything's green and everything's bright and sunny.
Absolutely. So I think this conversation comes as kind of sort of fate. It's more of an aligned moment. When we connected, I actually had quite a few questions on how to grow your own produce, what's the best to buy, organic, non-organic, pesticides, fertilizers, lots of questions surrounding soil, especially with diminishing healthy soil in the world, especially that creates things like B12. And obviously, is it then to start your own due to the cost of living in some places and growing things? All of which I'm no expert in whatsoever, and I wouldn't even know where to start. And then a few days later, we connected, and it's kind of like the stars aligned, and now we're here.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk to people about how to garden and how to do it in a plant-based way.
So you're I'm guessing, expert in gardening and the the co-founder of Veganic. So if we delve into you, what's your journey that created the love you have for growing food now? And but not that, but where did that help? Like, where did that start you helping creating your own place to start helping people as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I became vegan about 20 years ago. And like most people, I was buying all of my food from the grocery store. And then one day I started getting a bit more interested in growing my own food, just to reduce my ecological footprint, also just to reskill. I think it's a very important skill to have. And when I looked into it more, I realized how oftentimes our fruits and veggies, whether they're grown on farms or whether people grow them themselves at home, oftentimes they're grown using very non-vegan ingredients. And so the fertilizers can be things like chicken manure, blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, fish emulsion. Those are very common fertilizers that are used on both non-organic farms and organic farms. And as somebody who's vegan, I had already decided I didn't really want any of those animal products in my life. So as a gardener, I certainly didn't want to bring things like that into my gardens. And I was really lucky because when I was kind of starting out on that journey, I met someone named Stefan Grolot, and he had actually been gardening veganically for several years, and he had studied organic agriculture, and he actually taught me how to garden. So I learned how to garden using totally plant-based fertilizers right away, which was really awesome. But it's a different experience because instead of going to a garden center and picking up something like blood meal, well, then you have to kind of figure out what are the plant-based alternatives and what can we use instead. And so that led us back, this was 15 years ago, back in 2008, to start the Veganic Agriculture Network, which is to promote plant-based farming and gardening and the techniques to do that. And then more recently, about 3 years ago, we started teaching a gardening course called Learn Veganic. And really that's to kind of bring people through kind of a similar experience I had, which was just having someone, lead me step by step through how I could do things in a veganic way. So it's an area that not many people know about. So that's kind of why we put our concentration there, just to kind of get this info out to the world and to make it so that other people could garden in a way that's either aligned with their values or more environmentally friendly. Because most info we find out there, really tells you how to garden with animal products. So it can be a lot harder to track down that info about how to do it in a plant-based way.
Absolutely, because I always assumed like you go into the grocery store and you see like the manure and the soil, the topsoil that you can buy for like growing your own like fruits and vegetables, but I never realized that that just had like animal ingredients in a lot of the time. I obviously, me being ignorant, was just kind of like, but I think that's most people as well, is they just assume it is just soil. You don't assume there's other ingredients in there. So what kind of ingredients do you normally see, or what's to look out for when you are picking up like a soil or a fertilizer? What do we need to look out for? But is it on the packaging? Does it even say on the packaging?
It, it changes from country to country. So some things will be way more obvious. Like if you go into a garden center, some things will literally just say bone meal or blood meal, and that's exactly what's in the box. Other things, it'll say, topsoil or soil or fertilizer. And in those cases, it can be really hard to tell. Sometimes it's chemical fertilizers, sometimes it's animal based, sometimes it might be plant based. And the wording can be a bit confusing. So, for example, if something says fertilizer, it could really be any type of fertilizer, and it could really come from pretty much any origin. If something says compost, we typically think of that as meaning composted veggie scraps, but that could also be composted sheep manure, or it could be composted shrimp residues from the fishing industry. So, I've gone to buy soil from people before, and I've asked what's in it, and they say, oh, it's a great soil, it's got compost. And I'll say, well,
Mhm.
what type of compost? And then they'll say, well, it's crab and fish compost. So even a word like compost that we might associate with being vegetable in origin, it isn't necessarily. So That's why I personally prefer, as much as possible, to make a lot of my fertilizers myself. So, for example, when we make our own compost at home, well, then we can make entirely plant-based compost. We just don't put in any animal ingredients. And there's some other wonderful plants we can grow, like nettles, for example. Nettles is a plant that's really nutrient rich, so you can grow it and then feed it back to your other plants. But when we're looking at kind of commercial sources, sometimes we just need to phone the company. And then in some areas, you'll find products that are labeled as being vegan or labeled as being all plant-based, where some of them will list all of their ingredients. So, for example, some common ingredients that would be plant-based on the commercial side of things would be like alfalfa meal, soybean meal. In some cases, there could be rock dusts too that are mixed in. That's not quite as environmentally friendly, but it's still, at least it's not animal-based. And then there are some companies that have put out entire lines of vegan fertilizer products, more so in England and the US. So if someone's in England or the US, it's a lot easier to go online, order something and have it shipped to your door. Where I am in Canada, there's like one product. So, in Canada, I have to do a lot of kind of do-it-yourself, making my own vegan fertilizers, whereas some other countries, it's a bit easier.
That's so, yeah, like when I didn't realize there was that much that went into it, because like I'm not even too sure what blood meal is, or I can only assume by the name what it is. So obviously when you're having more, organic, very healthy plant-based soils, is there more advantages to this?
Yeah, for sure. And just to say, blood meal is exactly what you'd think it is. It's basically dehydrated blood that's left over from slaughterhouses. Bone meal is leftover bone that's been kind of ground up. So it's exactly what it sounds like. So, a lot of the fertilizers that are out there on the market, even oftentimes in the organic sector, are basically slaughterhouse byproducts and factory farm byproducts. In terms of the advantages, there's so many advantages. I would say pretty much any advantage that we can think of for a plant-based diet, those advantages really, go over to plant-based gardening and farming. So, for example, the sustainability side of things, it's really unsustainable to have animal agriculture. If we want to move away from animal agriculture, we need to do that both through the food that we're eating and how we grow our food. There's also a number of contaminants that can work their way into animal agriculture that can also work their way into the fertilizers. So, for example, in some cases, animals are fed heavy metals. In chicken manure, there have been problems, especially in the past, but it might still be happening in some areas today, of chickens being fed arsenic as an antiparasitic. Then there's arsenic in the chicken manure, and that's where you end up with things like arsenic in the organic rice supply. Because chicken manure with arsenic was used to grow organic rice, and even things like E. coli. When we look at the salmonella and E. coli outbreaks that sometimes happen, and it's blamed on spinach or it's blamed on lettuce. Well, it should really be blamed on the manure that ended up on that spinach or that ended up on that lettuce. So we can end up having a lot of contaminants entering our food supply, even the organic food supply that we might not suspect. And when we move over to growing with plant-based fertilizers, it doesn't necessarily resolve all of those issues magically, but it really reduces them and it makes it a lot easier to manage.
Yeah, I was about to say, so like, it's weird because I think like the animal agriculture industry have really done dirty on us all, because I think every different facet of life that you could kind of think of, they've really got their little claws in there as well. Like I never assumed that, people going and gardening in their back garden, I thought, it's going to be more organic, more healthier. But obviously if they're picking up these soils and there's these issues as well with that, then especially if you're a vegan and you're not overly too sure of what you're picking up either, or you weren't aware, it's you're growing your very, like, your fruits and vegetables in a soil that has been developed within that industry that has bits and pieces in. So that, like, obviously, then that really begs the question on, is then your, like, let's say your tomato, like, vegan friendly? Obviously the tomato itself, yes. The way it's grown, no.
Exactly. That's where we have this big disconnect right now. Anything where a food is made out of plants, we call it vegan, but it doesn't mean that the way it was grown was in a vegan way. And that's one thing that I like about gardening, is at least with gardening, we have the choice and we're more empowered to grow foods in a way that's veganic and in a way that doesn't include any animal products. Whereas at the grocery store, we don't know. And even if we did know, we probably would find that we didn't have that many options. So I really like the fact that with gardening, we can really decide, what are our values, or what do we want to be putting into our garden. And in some cases, it might take us a few months or even a year or two to get everything in place to kind of do a transition from what we're currently using to grow our own food in our own garden to making it totally veganic. There can be like a bit of a transition and things to learn, but we can get there. And I just love the fact that I can grow my own food, and all sorts of foods that are really interesting too, foods I can't necessarily find in grocery stores. Like, there's all sorts of exciting things about gardening that go beyond growing it veganically, but the thing I love the most is just knowing that I'm growing food that's so aligned with my values and that's healthier too.
So where you are at the moment, it's obviously, as you said, like a foot of snow.
Yeah.
What are you growing in that?
That's a good question.
Are you able to grow?
We have a lot of squash. So, we have squash that we grew in the summer. Here in Canada, we have a time of the year where there's nothing growing in our gardens. There's some snow. We have a lot of perennial plants that are surviving under that snow. So as soon as the snow is gone, I have a lot of green onions popping up and chives popping up and strawberries popping up. So we have a lot of things that are permanently there in our gardens, and they survive under the snow, no problem. And then we plant new stuff every year, like beans and potatoes and squash. Here we have very hot, summers with enough rain. So our season is quite a bit shorter than a lot of people's seasons. But for example, we have warmer weather here in the summer than than in England. So we definitely don't have the year-round growing season that you may in Australia. But that the shorter season we have, we work with it and we do our best with it.
Because I know quite a few people into gardening back home or growing their own fruits and vegetables. Obviously, some foods take quite a while to grow, whereas some things are very kind of like, you put them down, they've grown in about 4 days.
Yeah.
Much like your mushrooms as well. With mushrooms are very, they grow very quickly, and obviously, your herbs and things like that. We actually, when I was back in England living at home, my sister was very into composting. And my nan as well, before she passed, was very into growing like tomatoes and bits and pieces in a little greenhouse, which was always great. However, like for you, are you like fully sustainable, or are you sort of buying like fruit and vegetables from the store as well, or is everything you eat kind of grown from your garden now?
So it's a combo. I've lived in different places, and so I've been able to have gardens of different sizes in different places. So I have had a garden in the past that would produce quite a bit. One year we got 100 squash and 300 pounds of strawberries and all sorts of wonderful things like that. I've had smaller gardens in the places I've been renting more recently. And so I try to grow stuff that's either easier to grow or higher value, or that I can't find in the grocery store. And then I go to my farmers, my family farmers for everything else. And to be honest, I mean, unless someone really commits themselves to self-sufficiency and has a good area of land for it, most people don't reach self-sufficiency with their gardens. But we can still grow a decent portion of what we need.
That's amazing. That's one thing I think a lot of people do dream of. Like, I've dreamt of that in the past, of kind of being very self-sufficient, and kind of having my own land where I can kind of grow everything on, and just kind of eat from that. However, I know that is very far from the future. If any part of my future, I have no idea. Mainly because one, I need a giant plot of land to be completely self-sufficient, and also I have no idea where to start when it comes to growing vegetables.
One of the best things I did in terms of growing is one of my friends, he has a farm that he grew up on out in the countryside where his family still lives. And about 15 years ago, I planted a bunch of fruit trees there and fruit bushes. I wasn't even sure if I was still going to be in the area later, but I thought, I'm going to plant some fruit trees, I'm going to plant some fruit bushes, and we'll see if I'm still around when they start producing. And now it's been just, more than 10 years of just getting big harvests of apples and pears and blueberries every year. And it's amazing because, I probably spent $20 on a tree 15 years ago, and I've just had, cases and cases and cases of fruit from each of these trees. So that's one thing. I mean, that requires having access to land to a long period of time, but there are things that we can do that are relatively low maintenance. With a classic garden with tomatoes and lettuce, that's wonderful too. But though it doesn't involve a long-term commitment, but it does involve kind of restarting every year. So I like having some of these perennial plants where we can have a low-maintenance garden, and even if we don't even visit the garden very often, it mostly takes care of itself.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is that kind of, even if I wanted a low, like as you say, a low maintenance one, it is that starting every year. And I think that is obviously for some people, because I think people have the dream to become, start growing or anything, but it's the kind of time and effort it also takes, and obviously if you need to restart. But is it actually in the long run, once you've actually got the fruits and vegetables that you created yourself, like, is it actually? Because obviously it is a commitment, but is it as time consuming as people assume it is?
There's always that period in the spring, during the planting time where we have, often a window that's a little bit short in order to get everything in at the right time. So, I'll have a certain time of the year where I wouldn't necessarily take a vacation because I know I should be there for my garden, during kind of a 3-week period to get everything in. But after that, it's not necessarily much of a time commitment, especially if we can get some things a little bit more automated. For example, if we have watering systems, that are a little bit more hands-off. But there's also the question of, is it something that we can just simply enjoy? Because I think a lot of us spend so much time on our computers, so much time sitting, so much time doing other types of repetitive tasks, and to actually go outside and be in the sunshine for 20 minutes and kind of watch how our plants developed from last week to this week and how they're going to develop next week and how they just keep changing, and to participate in that cycle. And that in and of itself can just be a wonderful, fascinating hobby. So I would just say, I actually learned how to garden because I kind of felt a sense of responsibility to learning how to grow my own food. And I didn't think I was actually going to like it. It didn't occur to me that I would like it until I started doing it. And once I started doing it, I was like, this is super fascinating. This is so fascinating and so exciting. And then sometimes after a while, I'll realize there's one part of it I'm not enjoying as much. So maybe I'll just stop doing that part that I'm not enjoying as much, and then I'll find some other fascinating aspect that I can do, that I can concentrate on instead. So I would say just to, more than anything, try to find the fun hobby in it.
Yeah, as you said, obviously people are doing tasks over and over again that either sitting down watching Netflix for hours and on. So people do have 20 minutes in a day just to kind of look after a garden if they have a garden. 20 minutes isn't a long time, especially when it was a lot of the time. I find myself doing it sometimes. I would class myself as a very productive person. However, there's days that I will sit there, forget that the TV's on, end up watching the TV, and it's been 2 hours, 3 hours later. I'm like, what have I just done? I could have done something a bit more productive with that time, whether that, learn something or go to the gym or do something a bit more productive. So people do, as much as people say that they don't have the time, and then there will be people that say that literally do not have the time. But the majority of us have 20 minutes in the day just to kind of, learn, or if you were to have a garden, kind of just water and just make sure everything's okay with it.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there are ways too, if somebody really wants to match it up with something that might be a bit more productive in their lives, we can, of course, garden and listen to a podcast at the same time and things like that. Uh, when we're doing our first garden, it's best to be like 100% concentrated. You know, when we're first learning how to do something, we need to be really focused. But later on, there are tasks like uh, watering a garden, you know, that we can do while we, you know, even just think about our future plans and all sorts of other things, you know. I mean, even just having some time to daydream out in the garden or listen to a podcast or whatever it might be, there's ways we can match it up with other things in our lives.
So how many gardens have you had altogether? Because I assume that you've not just had one, you've had many.
Yeah, well, even this past summer, I essentially had 4 different gardens this past summer. One in front of the apartment I'm renting, one at my neighbor's house because it was too big for her, so I went and helped her and I did half of her garden. And a community garden, and this one that's out in the countryside on my friend's family farm. And it's really actually fascinating to garden in different places because, you know, there can be really different soil types, there can be different temperatures and like different opportunities at different places. And I've had container gardens on balconies before in the city, and I'm someone who's fascinated by all the different ways that we can garden. So if I have a new opportunity to have a garden somewhere, I'm just fascinated by seeing like what's the opportunity here, you know, what type of gardening technique can I use in this environment.
So, like, obviously, when you are able to do it on like balconies and stuff like that, that's permaculture, right?
So, okay, we can talk about what permaculture is, which is different perhaps from balcony gardening. So, balcony gardening would just be gardening on a balcony in containers. Permaculture is actually more of a design approach or a design philosophy. You can apply some aspects of permaculture to a balcony, but it's easier to apply permaculture to, you know, a backyard or a larger area. Permaculture is the idea of looking at nature, trying to figure out what makes nature efficient and resilient and abundant, and then trying to take those lessons and apply them in our gardens. So, an example is that in nature, everything is integrated and nothing is separated. And so, if you look at a natural ecosystem, there's all sorts of different connections between all of the different elements. They're all working together. And in nature, you don't have a compost bin separated from where you grow your plants, right? In nature, that's all integrated. There's leaves that fall on the ground and they break down and that becomes soil, and then some seedlings pop up. And so if we were going to imitate that in our gardens, we could actually compost directly in our gardens. At the end of a gardening season, we could take our plants, we could lay them down on the soil, cover them with some leaves, and we could basically have a bit of an integrated system. There's a lot of different lessons that we can learn from permaculture, but basically what we're doing is we're trying to make our gardens function as much as possible like a natural ecosystem so that we don't have to water them as much, we don't have to maintain them as much, and so that they'll be more abundant and more resilient to change. So yeah, if you're in Australia right now, right, Callum?
Yeah, yeah, yes, Sydney.
Yeah, and so there's some folks in Australia who kind of came up with the idea of permaculture back in the 1970s, and yeah, we practice permaculture in our own gardens, and it's wonderful because we often find that our gardens do turn into little ecosystems. We end up with toads visiting and hummingbirds visiting, and yeah, it's really about, you know, trying to bring back a more natural approach to gardening.
So I do love that as well. Like just the thought of having a more natural kind of like diverse kind of little ecosystem within the garden. And I'm guessing that's where like obviously organic techniques do work as well, because you're creating more biodiversity in the garden. As well as obviously, you know, you've got healthier soil, and you've got a lower environmental impact as well. So also when it comes to the environmental impact, like how is that measured?
So, did you ask how it's measured?
yeah, how the environmental impact of soil is measured. Because obviously, I think when we have like, when we've got factory farming, things like that,
Yeah.
we know exactly how that's measured. However, when it comes to things like soil, something people don't really think about, how do we measure the kind of environmental impact
That's
on
a great question, and I mean, I think it's something we can look at from different angles. One is that any home gardener is probably not going to be directly measuring the environmental impact of their soil, but some things we can look at. One is that in a lot of places, especially on agricultural lands on farms, there's a lot of erosion, and so that can be erosion from the wind carrying soil away or from the rain coming and washing soil away. But if you look near farmland, oftentimes the rivers are going to be brown. And the rivers are brown because it's full of soil, because the farms are losing soil. So that's one kind of way of measuring, something related to soil, is just the way in which so many practices are actually losing soil. And soil which is built up extremely slowly in a natural environment, like in the forest, is actually being lost quite quickly on farmlands. So that's one reason why in a garden or in a farming setting, it's really important to have the soil covered as much as possible, to have plants, as permanently as you can, a permanent soil cover of plants, or to use something like mulch. And mulch is basically anything that you use to cover the soil. So if you add leaves on top of the soil, then the leaves are a mulch. And this can just make it so that you don't lose your soil. Because one of the worst things that can happen is losing our soil. Soil's very slow to build up. It's pretty fast to lose if we don't take care of it. If we think of any natural ecosystem, the soil's always covered, and if ever it becomes uncovered because of a landslide or something, you'll have plants that pop up, very quickly to cover it. Whereas in typical gardens and farms, people tend to make the soil bare for a significant portion of the year, and then they're just losing that soil. So that's one way that we can sort of measure whether things are going well or not. Also, we can look at the organic matter in soil. So basically, organic matter means that you have things like compost that are in the soil, and organic matter can help retain water. It can also help with drainage. It can provide nutrients for plants. So that's one thing that people can measure with their soil, is what percentage of organic matter they have, and it's something that we try to build up over time. But the organic matter is also related to how much kind of carbon was captured through carbon sequestration too. So yeah, and another very simple thing people can do, and this isn't really related to environmental impact like the other two are, but you can also just observe your own soil to see whether it's sandy, whether it's heavy in clay or heavy in sand. You can even just look at the texture, and that's not related to environmental impact directly, but it does help you learn how to work with your soil better to have better harvests. Yeah.
That's mate. There's so much to think about there as well, especially when it comes to obviously soil, because I think, like as I said before, like nobody really thinks about what your like soil is just soil. It's just dirt. No one's really thinking too much into it. But like once you delve deep into the world of like soil and things like this, there's so much to think about. Because when I came into this podcast, apart from obviously you can grow food, and didn't realize there was obviously manures with animal products. I didn't know how much there was to like talk about when it comes to soil, but there's such a huge amount. Like there's so much to kind of like consider as well.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I love doing actually is making our own soil, because if you think about how soil is made out in nature, for the most part, a lot of our agricultural lands are deforested areas. So basically the soil was built up over thousands of years because there were trees there, and like little tree branches would fall and leaves would fall, and those would decompose and make soil. And so we do something similar where we kind of make soil from scratch, where we'll just take the chips of a whole bunch of little tree branches, and then we'll take like a whole bunch of leaves, and we'll just let them decompose and mix them together. So I have like my garden that's in front of the place I'm renting right now. I've actually made the soil entirely from scratch, just using like compost I made and decomposed leaves and decomposed tree branches. So it's really cool because we can, find ways to make soil ourselves without necessarily having to buy soil.
Like, so I think for obviously farmers as well, everybody, if they were to have healthier soil, benefits from it, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt about it. Everybody's going to benefit from healthier soil. But why is this not like a huge thing that people are pushing towards? Like, why are people like farmers, whether they be animal farmers or vegetable farmers, why aren't they pushing towards healthier soils? Because obviously, no matter what they're growing,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to come out a healthier produce. But obviously, at the moment, there's people aren't, or the majority of farming industries aren't using these healthier soils, especially the vegetable farmers.
Yeah, I mean, I think partly because there's so much factory farming, there is just so much on the market in terms of animal products that no one knows what to do with. I mean, if you look at something like, factory farms with chickens where there's literally millions of chickens there and there's all this manure that comes out, there's, I would say, in a sense, a push for people to figure out what to do with that waste product. And so it ends up going on fields. And I think when there's such easy access to materials and also, to chemical fertilizers, chemical fertilizers are very easy access. What I would say about some of the veganic techniques is that some of them do involve more learning. And so with for veganic farmers, one of the common techniques that's used is called green manures. And I know that the term green manure sounds gross, but it's not what it sounds like. It's actually just plants that you grow to feed back to the soil. So someone could grow something like clover or buckwheat, not with the intention of eating the buckwheat, but with the intention of just feeding it back to the soil. And so there's a farmer in England called Ian Tolhurst. He's been doing this for decades now. And he basically has a crop rotation where certain years he's just growing fertilizer for his fields. I mean, basically growing green manure as a fertilizer. And then even when a crop finishes, then he'll throw down, some green manure seeds so that he can keep replenishing his soil. But it does take more careful planning. It does take, a bit more knowledge. And so there's kind of that side of it that I think, on the home gardening side, it doesn't take as much planning or knowledge, because on the home gardening side, you can just say, I'm going to make some veggie compost. Whereas if you have 100 acres, well, then you have to do a lot more planning around it. So I think that there needs to be a lot more farmer education, and farmer to farmer education, because the potential is incredible. It's just that the information needs to get out there more.
I think that's the same with like a lot of industries, especially when it comes to more vegan ways of living. Especially in nutrition, there's still, and for instance, doctors as well, very little on vegan nutrition or nutrition at all. So I totally understand what you mean when you say, like, obviously the farmers obviously not having that knowledge as well, and obviously taking a lot more time and implementing. And obviously there's just an easier route, and the easier route for them is just use the soil that's already there, just as the same as someone in nutrition, for instance. The easiest way for them to somewhat be healthy or live is just to eat the diet that are on already, without changing and implementing other strategies in it to kind of be the healthiest they can be. Because either way, whatever way you look at it, whether it's soil or eating more of a whole foods plant-based diet, it's healthier for like nature and the body. But unless you have like the implemented tools or the knowledge there, it's going to be a bit of a struggle until you understand what's going on and how this works, why it works.
Yeah, for sure. And there's some similarities too, because I sometimes say that with veganic, what we're doing more than anything is feeding our soil a whole foods plant-based diet. And I mean, we have gardens where we're feeding them with our veggie scraps, we're feeding our gardens with hay, we're feeding our gardens with alfalfa, but basically we're taking whole plant foods and we're feeding that to our soil. And it really literally is our soil that's eating it, because our soils are full of, billions of little organisms. So there's worms, there's bacteria, there's arthropods. There's all sorts of little critters in the soil. And when we give organic matter to the soil, like our food scraps or some hay or something, all of those little critters, all of that soil life is going to break it down. And it's basically the digestive system of our soil. And once it breaks it down, then our plants can use it to grow. It's pretty incredible. And I mean, that's another thing I'd like to mention about veganic is it's not a system, that's free from animals, but rather it's a system where all the animals are free. And so there are animals in a veganic system, in our soil or little birds coming to visit. And so I know sometimes people can have the misconception that if we're doing plant-based agriculture, some people see that as, perhaps unnatural because they think it doesn't include animals. But on the contrary, it's more natural because it does include the animals that naturally live in the area.
Yeah, and I would say before, obviously, farming and that existed, that would have been the natural process. Like, just everything going on in nature without humans being involved in it. Like, that would have been the natural process of, like, birds, critters, all sorts, being around in those areas and just kind of everything working as one, as kind of like just ergonomically working.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So when it comes to veganic techniques, what should we be using in our own gardens, or what is a veganic technique?
Yeah, so basically veganic techniques are any techniques that are totally plant-based. And I mean, a complementary technique would also, again, be using rock dusts, which I personally don't really use, but that could be considered veganic too. So there's tons and tons of techniques that we can use. I will just mention that on our website, Learn Veganic, we have a veganic materials guide that people can download for free, and it shows 20 different techniques that we can use in our veganic garden. Because oftentimes with veganic, people just think of compost, and they think that that's all it is. But we can use so many things. Even some residues from the food industry. There are some food industries that just have some kind of waste products. We can take that, we can compost it down. But I mentioned the green manures, where we can grow plants in our gardens to kind of feed them back to the soil. One that I mentioned was hay. We have one of our gardens that's fertilized entirely with hay. We basically don't put anything else in that garden. And if we think about what hay is just a bunch of different grasses and legumes that have been grown together and cut while they're still green. And if we think about what cow manure is, well, cow manure is sometimes just made out of hay that a cow ate and then pooed out. And so we can think of manure and hay being relative equivalents. So what we do is we have one garden where instead of using cow manure, we just use hay directly, which is the original food source. It's the original source of nutrients. Because, one important thing to mention is sometimes people think of manure as being a source of nutrients. People will say, well, manure is, it's high in nitrogen or it's high in phosphorus or something else that plants need. And it's like, cows don't make nutrients. Cows don't make nitrogen. They don't make phosphorus. If there's nutrients like that in their manure, it's just because those nutrients were contained in their food. So we just take hay directly. That way we don't have to have any involvement with animal agriculture. And we just put hay directly on the soil, and all of the soil organisms will decompose it, and then we can just plant our plants through that. And then obviously most people don't have access to hay, but another thing that people can get fairly easily is alfalfa. And in England, it's more commonly called lucerne. And you can actually just buy bags of it. So it's often sold as like food for horses or food for rabbits. And you just need to make sure it's just 100% alfalfa, nothing else in it, because if there's something else, it could be animal, like beef tallow that's added or things like that. And we just get these pellets of alfalfa. They're, totally vegan, really high in nutrients. And we just sprinkle them around our garden, or we bury them in the soil, and then they just decompose there, and then they feed our plants. So that's one of the easiest things people can do especially if you're just starting out and you don't have much homemade compost ready yet. You can just buy a bag of alfalfa pellets and just use that straight up as fertilizer.
I will definitely link that part of your website down in the show notes as well. So if anybody actually
Wonderful.
does want to kind of, look into this some more, then feel free to just obviously click that link as well and have a little look at what you can do to obviously make your or how to start your little journey on that. So when it does come to, like the system of obviously converting people to a more veganic way of life, I did see on the website, it did have the little map of people that are doing it that way already, and Europe has loads. It's there was a huge amount in Europe, and I actually went and saw if there's any near my hometown in England. So I live in Essex, and there is two not too far away.
Oh,
Um,
lovely.
there's one in Kent and one just down the road. I can't remember what it's called now, the place, but I saw them and I was like, oh, they're very much like 20 miles from where I live. So it is obviously expanding.
Yeah. And yeah, that's the Vegan Organic Network that's based in England. They've been promoting plant-based agriculture since 1996, and they've put together a map for England. And then there's another group in Europe called Biocyclic, and they kind of promote plant-based techniques in farming. In many countries, but focused more in Europe, and they've added a bunch of farms to that map too. And then in North America, there's a university professor who put together a map of veganic farms in North America that you can find at our website goveganic.net, and there's definitely more veganic farms than the ones we see on the maps, because there's a lot of farms that aren't necessarily represented there unless somebody actually puts up their hand and says, I want to be added to a map. They don't necessarily make it on. But it's something we'd like to see expanding. And in North America and in Europe and in England, there are now veganic certification programs. So farms can become certified veganic or certified stock-free organic in England or certified biocyclic in Europe. And all of those are pretty much synonyms for plant-based agriculture.
Because from this as well, you've got the Veganic Agriculture Network, and then you've also created courses as well.
Yeah. So we have an online course where people can come and learn with us. And we created a website, about 15 years ago where people could go and just learn on their own. But we realized that some people, would like a lot more help with their gardens, answers to their questions, and that we could also put together a bit more of a step-by-step process, to show people how to grow veganically and also show people the wide variety of ways that we can grow veganically. So we created the Learn Veganic Gardening course, and it's a cool course because not only do we go through a lot of ways to garden veganically, but we also have Q&A meetups where people can ask us questions directly. And it's also an opportunity to meet other people around the world who are either already gardening veganically or just starting. Because oftentimes we don't know any other veganic gardeners in our area. So it's a nice way to create community too.
Yeah, it's a good way for community as well, I guess. Like you're connecting these people. I feel like when people do some of these things that are seen as kind of slightly obscure, but you're doing it different to how most people are, that you kind of feel quite alone. But obviously, when you're connecting these people, you're creating a sense of community, that you're not alone, and this is actually something that people want to do, and you're not just this kind of odd person in the corner, just doing something out of the realm of just difference. And you have a summit as well, don't you? Or did have a summit?
Yeah. So we had our first Veganic Summit at the beginning of November 2023. And that was really cool because it brought together experts in veganic farming and veganic gardening from around the world. And so that's at veganicsummit.com. And we are planning to hold our second Veganic Summit in November 2024.
Oh, that's amazing. So if I wanted to start something today, so this is my situation today. So obviously where I'm living is probably more of an urban approach. I'm on a as kind of skyrise in Sydney, it's very hot conditions. It rains,
Mhm.
maybe once every 2 weeks you'll have a bit of rainfall. I have a balcony. There's
Mhm.
not a huge amount of room on that balcony. If you were to lay down, you could probably fit about 3 or 4 people on it.
Okay.
That's the only way I can describe it, because I didn't go out and measure. So 3 or 4 people worked. What can I do with that? Like, if I wanted to start my journey today, what
Yep.
could I do with the obviously conditions of, it's hot heats here.
Yeah.
It doesn't really get cold.
So one thing I really like to do on balconies is what we call self-watering container gardens. And so it's container gardens that have an integrated water reservoir. So if you sometimes go to a restaurant, you'll see that they have, big buckets. They might get big buckets of soy sauce or big buckets that had oil in them. And what we do is we get those buckets from restaurants when they're going to throw them out. We give them a good wash. And if you put one bucket inside the other, it ends up creating a space between the two at the bottom. And so we actually have that as a water reservoir. And we put like a tube in so that we can kind of fill up the reservoir at the bottom. And then we have a way in which uh, we'll kind of put a little plastic cup in between the two so that the plant roots can go down into the plastic cup and get some water. And, there's a few steps to making one that I can't necessarily describe in detail on a podcast. But the thing that's really cool about it is we basically end up in a scenario where we have about a gallon of water that we can add to the bottom, and then the plant can just kind of suck it up with its roots. And this means that there's a lot less evaporation, because when you water from the top, a lot of that water just gets evaporated. And it means that there's just a bit more autonomy for the plant too, because in really, really hot conditions on a balcony, if you're just doing standard watering with your with your just by hand, you might have to water like twice a day. Whereas with this, we're watering once a day or once every 2 days. So it is a little bit easier in that sense. And also it just, conserves the water a lot better. And I would say in a really hot environment, you might want to concentrate on plants that are going to enjoy that heat. So tomatoes are really going to enjoy that heat. If you know your upstairs neighbor, if you're able to take some strings and attach it to their balcony, you can actually take a tomato plant and have it grow 10 feet high and just keep wrapping the string around the tomato plant, and that'll hold it up. And the nice thing about something like that, like climbing plants, and climbing plants can include tomatoes. Well, tomatoes aren't a classic climbing plant. You do have to kind of put the string around it. But beans will climb on their own, and so will cucumbers. And the nice thing is you can actually create some shade on your balcony. So you can try to work it in your favor to actually create a shady spot so that you can enjoy your balcony more. But tomatoes especially, they're going to enjoy that heat. Aubergines are going to enjoy the heat a lot too. And melons will, although melons aren't always the most space-efficient thing to grow on a balcony, but you can. So I would suggest just getting a few pots out there. You can also just do a very standard regular pot, and you just have to be, very careful about watering it a couple of times a day, anytime that they're looking heats, like they might get heat stressed. Or you can also set up a drip system. So you could, set things up with some little tubes and some little kind of a little drip system where you could just have, something like a water canister that's higher than all of your pots, and then a drip system with a drip line that's going to them. That's another way that you can try to give your plants a bit more autonomy.
That's great to know, because I just assumed that obviously maybe I had to grow some herbs at most. I wasn't too sure how much else I could grow, because obviously I see these things online. Like, I follow some people online that have their own little gardens, and they've got like pipes going up the side with like the little pipes coming out of things growing out of them, and I was like, oh, that'd be cool. I could probably do that on a balcony, but I wasn't too sure if there's anything else I could really do with it. But clearly I can be growing actually quite a bit.
Yeah, you can grow a lot. And one thing we like growing is on balconies is cherry tomatoes, because if you grow really big tomatoes, you might be waiting a long time for like that one tomato to ripen, and you don't have as many. Whereas with cherry tomatoes, you'll just get a few a day, during the time that it's like that they're ripening, you'll just have like several cherry tomatoes every day, and you can just keep adding them to your salads. And another one you might want to look into that does really well in hot weather is there's a plant called Malabar spinach, and it's not actually spinach, but it just tastes a bit like spinach. And it's a climbing plant that grows really well. I think it might be native to New Zealand. And it's one that's great on a balcony because, again, if you can get a string going up to your neighbor's balcony, you can just get this plant to climb all the way up.
That's amazing. Yeah, because it's one of those things I just wasn't too sure even where I'd start with balcony, or if it was even like, because it's very dry heat here. I wasn't too sure if there's anything I was actually able to physically grow. But if I want to kind of start, I know that I can start growing tomatoes. How long does a tomato take to grow, to be fair?
So every variety is a little bit different. They'll kind of say on the pack, some of them might say 60 days, some might say 70, some might say 80 or 90. It kind of depends. And so each variety will tell you. The other thing I would say, and this goes for anybody who's listening from anywhere in the world, no matter what month you're listening to this, just go online and try to find some gardening resources for your area. Because anyone in North America, you can look up the Farmer's Almanac. You can just put in your zip code or postal code, and it'll tell you the planting dates. And so in Australia and certain areas that are very, very hot, it will tell you when you need to plant something in order to actually have it see its way through the season. And in some cases, depending on where people are in the world, the planting dates might be there to help you avoid cold snaps and cold weather. And then in some cases, people might have certain planting dates to help you avoid weather that's way too hot. I know, for example, if you're in an area that's more tropical and it's the hot time of the year, it's probably not the best time to grow even kale, because kale tastes better in cooler weather because it gets sweeter. And something like lettuce might have a lot of difficulty during the hot season in a tropical area, and it might actually do better in more of the shoulder seasons rather than in the hottest or coldest seasons. So I would say to definitely look at what is somebody else doing down the street from you in Sydney? What are their planting dates? And especially if you're starting out, just go with the planting dates of what other people are using, because other people in general have already figured out the best timing.
And is there any kind of nutritional value or better plants to when you're eating more seasonal foods? So obviously everything kind of grows in their own different seasons. So should we be really kind of sticking to those kind of foods that you can find in those? I say in England, you got your lettuce, your kales, and it's very cold. I could stick with those, and then when it gets slightly hotter, I could start eating the other bits and pieces. Or does it not really matter? I
would say it has more to do with the planting dates than anything else. So just to give an example here, this is an example that's very particular to Canada, but there's a point at which the snow disappears. Then there's a point at which the ground unfreezes. Once the ground unfreezes, I can plant peas and fava beans and potatoes and cruciferous vegetables, but not much else. I have to wait till all of the freezes are gone until I can plant cucumbers and tomatoes and cantaloupe and stuff like that. And then, so here at least, I have to determine everything based on when is it realistic for me to plant something. In terms of when I'll eat it when it's ready. And so in a place like Australia, you are going to have more choice. And if you have a longer growing season, what you can do is successive planting, where you can say, I'm going to plant some lettuce, and then I'm going to plant some more 2 weeks later, and then 2 weeks later I'll plant even more lettuce, and then 2 weeks later even more lettuce, and that way you can make sure that you have longer harvests. But more often than not, you just need to eat the produce when it's ready, because if you let plants sit there when they were already ready, a lot of the time, either the fruit is going to end up going rotten, or something like a lettuce plant might just decide to bolt and go to seed if you don't harvest it. So
I think about that because obviously when a lot of people go to Australia, they have to go do the farm work for 3 months.
Right.
So now that I'm looking back at that and being like, what it took to grow this. So I went and worked on a banana farm, and a banana tree that takes a lot longer than 6-7 months to grow as well. So it's just those things must have been sitting there for years as well before obviously you're able to fully pick them. But one thing I did notice was that once you do pick a banana bunch from a tree, that you then have to chop down the tree, like, or at least half of it, otherwise it doesn't grow again.
Okay, I think that might be a bit particular to banana trees, because most plants in the garden you don't have to do anything like that.
Yeah, I did assume that would be the case, because that's the only kind of fruit I know of that you have to kind of cut down that whole entire thing. But now that I'm kind of thinking about it, about like pesticides and the fertilizers that were put on them, because you saw in the mornings there'd be planes going over shooting like pesticides and fertilizers all over, and just kind of how unhealthy that probably was as well, because obviously I was then breathing that in constantly for 3 months. But yeah, there's a huge amount of especially over here, there's farms for every different kind of like fruit and vegetable, and we have to go work on them to stay here a bit longer, which isn't the most fun. And I think that, to be fair, I think if somebody got put in that situation where they had to go and do that and were forced into it, it could probably really put them off, like, gardening in the future as well.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between having a very biodiverse garden where we've got all sorts of things growing versus having planes go over you with pesticides and doing the same thing for 3 months. Yeah, oftentimes, farms now are complete monocultures, and there often will be large amounts of pesticides, because if you do have a big monoculture, oftentimes that, one pest for that particular fruit or that particular vegetable will tend to congregate. When we have really biodiverse gardens, it can be a lot more fun, a lot more interesting to explore, and I don't even worry about having sort of pests in the garden, because I just figure if I plant 20 different things and I lose 5 of them, who cares? I still have a bunch of stuff to eat. And so I don't even really worry too much about whether there's some insects coming into the garden and munching on some stuff.
So I was gonna ask about that, because obviously a lot of people grow things and they find like something's been half eaten. Like, is that something you're stopping or just letting that happen?
On my end, I just let it happen. I just find, personally, I find it just less stressful just to say, I'm putting a garden in for the world, for biodiversity, to increase biodiversity, and I also happen to eat a bunch of food from it. Rather than having the mindset of, that's my kale plant, what happened to my kale plant? I have had that mindset in the past, and I find it's actually just a bit more stressful. Whereas when I have, just more of just the approach that I'm just putting the garden out there for the world, and I also get a lot out of it, I find it's just a nicer way to interact with the world personally. But that being said, of course, we can protect our crops if we want to. I know a lot of people who do, and I totally understand why. I understand the idea that if we put a lot of time into something, then we want to eat the end result. So I like to promote, ways of protecting crops that are not problematic for animals at all. So it can involve, for example, putting a mesh over something, or even putting a fence up. If someone lives in an area where there's deer, and the deer are coming and eating everything in the garden, well, yeah, I understand in that sense why it's important to put a fence around the garden, just so that you actually get a harvest from it. So yeah, there's a lot of things like that we can do. And one of my favorite techniques, which is really simple, and it's not necessarily going to protect all your crops, but it'll help a bit, is just putting in water points where animals can come and drink. Because animals get really thirsty, just like us. It's just that they don't have taps, they don't have sinks, they don't have ways of accessing water, and most of the natural water sources, we've just paved over them. There used to be rivers all over the place that have kind of been paved over and been put kind of, into underground piping and things like that. And so Now, instead of having all the dips and grooves that you'd find in a natural ecosystem and puddles, now everything's kind of like asphalt, and animals don't necessarily have an easy time finding water sources. So imagine if you were a squirrel that was really thirsty, and what you found was a tomato or a cucumber. Well, you'd probably eat that tomato or cucumber, whereas perhaps if there was a water source, then you might go for that water source. So I like that as a way of reducing, some damage from animals. Is just making sure that they've got something to drink.
That's such a good way of doing it as well, because I don't think many people think of it in that way. They just assume that they're just being pests. They're just eating, not realizing that it is maybe they are thirsty, or they are just, looking for some kind of substance.
Yeah.
But obviously, people do forget that animals do get thirsty as well. We are very much the same as them. We all have our needs that we need to survive. So it's one of those things that people just assume, they're just being pests. They're just they're eating all my crops, things like that. When there's normally a reason for it. Obviously, there are going to be some just eating for the fun of it. But we all have needs and wants.
Yeah, and I think one way I look at it too is we've actually destroyed their habitat. We've basically taken natural habitat, we've cut it all down, we've put streets, we've put houses, and then we finally put in some lovely, vegetables, and then we get upset if someone else comes and eats them. But, it's normal that animals eat food. It's just totally normal. So, I just like to remember that, it is their habitat still, even if we have altered it considerably. And another technique that can be nice too, and I've seen some farmers use this, is just to make sure that there are a lot of native plants. So I know one person who has an orchard, and at first the birds were eating a lot of the cherries from the cherry trees, which he wasn't too pleased about. But then some of the birds basically came and planted some seeds from stuff they actually like, just by the birds kind of flying nearby and leaving some droppings that had seeds in it. And he let some of those native plants grow that had berries that the birds really, really enjoy. And those are berries that have no economic value for humans. Humans aren't even supposed to eat them because they're kind of poisonous for humans. But it's what the birds like to eat the most. And what he found was that once those bushes were there, the birds stopped eating the cherries, because the cherries wasn't their favorite food. It was just the only food they could find if he kept cutting down their native habitat.
That's such a good way of thinking about it as well, and doing that, because obviously you're just kind of feeding them what they need when they come into the garden, and then your vegetables, your fruits, they're safer.
Yeah, exactly.
So you said that you went vegan 20 years ago?
Yeah, about 20 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, how was that back then, 20 years ago? There's obviously you don't have... So I've spoken to quite a few people that have been vegan, 20 years or more, and just kind of diverting yourself round food and shopping back then, because there were what we have now is obviously remarkable, and you didn't have that back then. You may have had a few kind of alternatives, maybe a bean burger or something like that. There wasn't what we have now. So what was that 20 years ago for you?
So I have to say, when I first became vegan 20 years ago, I was actually living in Toronto, and Toronto had a really good health food store. So basically, more than anything, I had to go way across town. But once I got way across town, there was actually a really nice selection. And at the time, I was at the University of Toronto, and there was a little vegan cafe on campus. So between those two resources, it was actually fine. But by the time I got into contexts where it was more complicated and maybe there weren't nearly as many options available, by that time I had actually learned how to cook. And so, as long as I had black beans and sweet potatoes and things like that, today I don't necessarily need any special products, because I know how to cook with the sort of, the most fundamental, basic vegan foods. But I have to say that during my first year or so of being vegan, I very much appreciated having vegan ice cream and vegan cream cheese and all of those things. And I'm glad that I was living in an area that had that.
Yeah, but I would say especially when you know how to cook and you've got these whole foods in front of you, it is so easy to just kind of like
Yep.
create meals in front of you. Like my diet is predominantly, I'd say 90%, 95% like a whole foods plant-based diet. But obviously when you get given like a courgette or just kind of like some fruit, people are like, well, this is going to be boring. This is going to be awful, until you learn how to cook and realize you can make these incredible dishes with these very beautiful whole foods like readily available, which kind of cuts out the need for any kind of like alternative. Although once in a while a pizza I can't deprive myself, but yeah, it's very much, as long as you know how to cook and you've got those like you've learned the kind of ways and what to do with vegetables and things like that, you kind of set yourself up for like a very easy life.
Absolutely, absolutely. Once we've learned how to cook with just whole grains and beans and spices and veggies, I mean, there really are thousands of different meals that we can make with that. And yeah, it's pretty exciting. Everything we can invent, or or even just what's available online now with recipes today has advanced so much too. And it's just wonderful to see that even starting from whole foods, just the wide array of things that we can create.
Yeah, but I see so many. I follow a lot of recipe creators. I'm finding new foods that I didn't even realize existed, because I think that people think that you're kind of giving up a lot when you're not eating meat, and realistically, it's about 5 things that you do give up. It's like four main meats and kind of maybe some dairy. But then when you go into like the plant section, or the plant, you're literally, there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of things that I never knew existed, never tried, and all different flavors. Yeah, and like there's like 1,000 ways to different like cook with them. You can obviously steaming's not a great way, because steaming is the reason people don't like vegetables half the time. But once you kind of have a little play around with like roasting and just kind of like blending or frying and stuff with all these different things, there's a huge array of different vegetables there you can play around with.
Yeah, and I can say that for me, I was such a picky eater before I became vegan because I had a few things I liked and I pretty much didn't like anything else, and I just kind of had to expand my palate. I mean, I didn't like most vegetables. I didn't like tomatoes. And so that was the toughest part for me with the transition. Was I was just, I was still kind of a teenager, and there were so many foods I didn't like. And I'm actually just really grateful that it just gave me that impetus to expand my palate, try new things, and just learn how to like stuff. Because now, I mean, there's only a couple of foods I don't like. I mean, a really bitter endive, I'm not a fan, but pretty much everything else that's vegan, I'm happy eating. And so I think that I ended up expanding my food repertoire so much when I made that switch.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the things that does happen, is you do extend and expand like your palate to an array of different foods. And you say there's a few things you're just not going to like. That's just human nature. Like things you're just not going to enjoy. Things like, for me, it's swede or turnips. Like I just can't get behind them. But the majority of other things I'm absolutely fine with. I have no issues with most foods, as long as they're cooked right or they taste great. Then I have absolutely no issues with any of them. It's just, yeah, I don't know what it is with swede. Whatever you do to it, no matter how you do it, it's still not great. But so I'm going to wrap this up in a second. So I do have one last question. The question I ask every guest on here, and that is: you've had a long day, you're feeling lazy, but you want to cook something. You want to cook something, something quick and easy. What is that food that you're going to go make?
Oh, quick and easy. There's a recipe that I love from. There's a food blog called "It Doesn't Taste Like Chicken," and there's a recipe called "Sweet Korean Lentils," and it's just red lentils with some garlic in it, some ginger, some soy sauce, and it's just delicious. I just absolutely love this recipe, and it might take about 15 minutes to make, something like that, which is, for the most part, just waiting for it to simmer. So yeah, that's one of my favorites.
Oh, that sounds amazing, actually. And what website was that on? It doesn't taste like chicken.
It doesn't taste like chicken.
I'm going to have to look that up later because that actually sounds delicious. So, Meg, where can we find you?
So the best place to find us is Learn Veganic. So we're at learnveganic.com, and you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram as Learn Veganic.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.